The Texas morning came harsh and unforgiving, painting the sky in shades of rust and gold while the wind carried dust across land that had forgotten what rain looked like. Samuel McKenna sat on his porch, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands, watching the sun climb over pastures where cattle graze on grass that crunched like old bones beneath their hooves. At 58, he'd learned to measure time not in days or seasons, but in the spaces between memories that still cut too deep to touch. The graves lay 50 yards from the house, 2 wooden crosses that marked the resting place of everything he'd ever loved. Clara, taken by influenza in the winter of 1918, her laughter silenced by the same disease that had swept through the county like a scythe through wheat. And beside her, little Thomas, barely 6 years old, who'd followed his mother into whatever waited beyond the fever dreams that had claimed them both. For years had passed since Samuel had spoken more than a dozen words to another human being, for years of existing rather than living in a house that echoed with the ghosts of conversations that would never resume. His nearest neighbor lived 12 miles east. The town of Cedar Falls was a day's ride south, and the only regular company came from cattle that had learned not to expect anything beyond feed and water from the man who owned them. The letter arrived with the morning mail, carried by a rider who'd taken the territorial government contract for delivering official correspondence to ranchers scattered across the high plains. Samuel accepted the envelope with the kind of resigned curiosity that marked men who'd stopped expecting good news from any source, opening it to reveal script that carried the formal weight of bureaucratic necessity. The words were simple enough to understand, even if their implications stretched beyond anything Samuel had imagined possible when he'd risen that morning. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was requesting his presence at a meeting in Cedar Falls, a gathering that would address ongoing difficulties between territorial authorities and certain Native American communities whose land claims remain in dispute. Difficulties, Samuel read aloud, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. He'd heard enough stories from other ranchers to understand that difficulties meant the Lakota bands that had been displaced from their traditional territories were refusing to accept the reservation boundaries that government officials had drawn, without consulting the people who actually lived on the land in question. The letter was signed by Agent Morrison, a man whose reputation for solving complex problems through creative interpretation of federal regulations had made him both feared and respected throughout the territory. If Morrison was calling a meeting, it meant the situation had progressed beyond the point where normal diplomatic channels could contain whatever was building toward explosion. Samuel had no particular interest in territorial politics or the complex legal questions that surrounded Native American land rights, but he'd learned that ignoring government requests was often more trouble than complying with them. Besides, the ride to Cedar Falls would break the routine of solitude that had begun to feel more like imprisonment than choice. The journey took most of the day, following roads that traced the ancient paths carved by buffalo herds and hunting parties before white settlement had transformed the landscape into something that existed more on paper than in a relationship between people and the land they inhabited. As Samuel approached Cedar Falls, he could see that the usually quiet town had been transformed by the presence of visitors. Cavalry units whose horses filled the livery stable, government officials whose black carriages spoke of authority imported from distant capitals, and scattered groups of Native Americans whose presence suggested that whatever was being negotiated involved people who had their own ideas about justice and fairness. The meeting took place in the town hall, a building that had been designed to accommodate the monthly gatherings where local ranchers discussed water rights and cattle prices, but which now strained to contain the complex tensions that fill the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Samuel found himself seated between ranchers he recognized and officials he didn't, facing a delegation of Lakota leaders whose dignity and composure suggested that they understood exactly what was at stake in whatever negotiations were about to unfold. Agent Morrison opened the proceedings with the kind of formal speech that bureaucrats delivered when they needed to make uncomfortable realities sound like reasonable compromises. The situation, he explained, had reached a point where federal authorities could no longer ignore the competing claims that threatened to destabilize the entire region. Military action remained an option, but one that would be costly for all involved and might create precedents that Washington preferred to avoid. Which brings us, Morrison continued, his gaze moving across the assembled faces like a man calculating odds and possibilities, to the proposal that Chief Standing Bearer has brought to our attention. The Lakota leader who rose to address the gathering carried himself with the kind of authority that came from leading people through impossible circumstances, from making decisions that would affect generations, while working within constraints that left few good options available. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear, marked by the accent of someone for whom it remained a deliberately learned language. "My people have lived on this land since the time when the world was young," Standing Bear said, his voice carrying easily through the crowded room. "We have seen many changes, have adapted to new realities, have sought always to find ways of living in peace with those who came after us." He paused, his dark eyes moving across the faces of white ranchers and government officials whose decisions would determine whether his people continued to exist as a community or were scattered to reservations where they would become statistics rather than human beings. "But now we face a choice that allows no compromise, no further retreat. The soldiers want our remaining lands for white settlement. Our children face a future where they will have no place to call home, no connection to graves of their ancestors, no hope of maintaining the ways that have sustained us for countless generations." Standing Bear's gaze settled on Samuel, studying him with the intensity of someone trying to read character in the lines of a stranger's face. "There is, however, one path that might allow us to remain on land that has always belonged to us. A path that requires sacrifice from both our peoples, but which might preserve what matters most to those who understand that some things are worth protecting." Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach as he began to understand why he'd been specifically invited to this gathering, why Morrison's letter had found its way to a rancher who'd never shown interest in politics or diplomacy. "What kind of sacrifice?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. "Marriage," Standing Bear said simply. "Between my daughter and a white man whose word carries weight in your community, whose presence on our land would make it legally impossible for the government to claim that we are trespassing on territory that belongs to others." The proposal hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that no one in the room had expected when the day began. Samuel found himself thinking about loneliness and purpose, about the difference between existing and living, about the strange paths that led people from one kind of life to another. "Who is your daughter?" Samuel asked, understanding that he was probably agreeing to something that would transform everything he thought he knew about his own future. "Her name is Wiaka," Standing Bear replied, and something in his voice suggested that this sacrifice was as difficult for him as it would be for the man who accepted it. "In your language, she is called Feather. She is 26 years old, educated in both our ways and yours, and she understands that sometimes the survival of many requires the sacrifice of one." The woman who would become Samuel's wife stood at the edge of the gathering like a shadow made flesh, her presence so still and composed that he might have missed her entirely if Standing Bear hadn't gestured toward the figure who'd been observing the proceedings from a respectful distance. Wiaka moved through the crowded room with fluid grace, approaching the center of negotiations that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of her entire people. Samuel's first impression was of someone who carried herself with a kind of dignity that couldn't be taught or assumed, only earned through experiences that had burned away everything superficial and left behind something essentially true. She was beautiful in a way that weathered stone was beautiful, marked by time and hardship, but possessing a strength that suggested she could endure whatever storms might come. Her dark hair was braided with strips of leather and small silver ornaments that caught the lamplight, and she wore a dress that mixed traditional beadwork with practical frontier cotton in a way that spoke of someone who lived between two worlds without fully belonging to either. But it was her eyes that held Samuel's attention, dark brown, almost black, holding depths of intelligence and sorrow that reminded him why he'd learned to be careful about looking too closely at other people's pain. "Mr. McKenna," she said, her voice carrying the careful courtesy of someone who'd been raised to understand that formal situations required formal behavior. "My father tells me you've agreed to consider his proposal." "I've agreed to listen," Samuel corrected gently, understanding that the distinction mattered to someone whose entire future hung on the outcome of this conversation. "Question is whether you've had any say in what's being proposed." Something shifted in Wiaka's expression. Not surprise, exactly, but recognition that she was dealing with someone who understood that her consent mattered as much as his own. "I have had every say that circumstances allow," she replied with quiet dignity. "I understand what my father is asking, what you would be sacrificing, and what my people would gain from such an arrangement. And what would you gain? Samuel asked, genuinely curious about how a young woman could accept marriage to a stranger as a reasonable solution to political problems she'd had no part in creating. Wiaka was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much truth was safe to share with someone whose motivations remained unclear despite his apparent willingness to consider her father's proposal. I would gain the knowledge that my people would continue to exist, she said finally, that our children would grow up on land that remembers our ancestors, that our ways would survive even if they must change to accommodate new realities. That's what your people would gain, Samuel observed. What about you personally? What I gain personally is the opportunity to serve something larger than my own happiness. Wiaka replied with a kind of certainty that came from someone who'd made peace with sacrifices that others might find unbearable. In our traditions, that is considered a privilege rather than a burden. Samuel absorbed this response, understanding that he was looking at someone whose sense of duty had been shaped by cultural values that prioritized collective survival over individual fulfillment. It was a perspective that both impressed and saddened him, evidence of strength that had been forged in circumstances no one should have to endure. What would you expect from such a marriage? Samuel asked. What kind of life are you imagining we'd build together? I would expect respect, Wiaka said simply. I would expect to be treated as a partner rather than a possession, to have my opinions valued even when they differ from yours. In return, I would offer the same respect, the same partnership, the same commitment to making whatever we build together worthy of the sacrifices that created it. Agent Morrison, who'd been listening to this exchange with the attention of someone whose career depended on the successful resolution of complex political problems, chose this moment to interject his own perspective on the practical benefits of the proposed arrangement. Mr. McKenna, Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke for distant powers that could make life very difficult for people who failed to appreciate the wisdom of cooperation. This marriage would provide significant advantages for both parties involved. Your ranch would gain legal protections that few other properties in the territory can claim, and future Mrs. McKenna would enjoy the security that comes with American citizenship and the backing of territorial law. What kind of legal protections? Samuel asked, suspicious of bureaucratic language that made simple things sound complicated and complicated things sound simple. Treaty rights, Morrison explained. As the wife of a white citizen, she would have legal standing to challenge any attempts at forced relocation. More importantly, any land that becomes part of your ranch through this marriage will be protected by the same laws that protect white-owned property. Samuel felt pieces clicking together in his mind as he understood the elegant complexity of what Standing Bear had proposed. By marrying his daughter to a white rancher, the chief would effectively place his people's remaining territory under protection of American property law, making it legally impossible for the government to claim that they were trespassing on their own land. How much land are we talking about? Samuel asked. Approximately 12,000 acres, Morrison replied. Prime grazing land with natural springs and timber rights that would make your operation one of the most valuable in the territory. The numbers were staggering, representing wealth that Samuel had never imagined possessing and responsibilities that went far beyond simple ranch management. But looking at Wiaka's face, reading the careful hope that she was trying to hide behind formal composure, Samuel understood that the most important calculation wasn't economic, but moral. When would this marriage take place? Samuel asked, directing his question to Wiaka rather than to the men who'd been negotiating her future without consulting her preferences. As soon as possible, she replied. Every day we delay is another day that federal authorities might decide to act without waiting for diplomatic solutions. And you're certain this is what you want? Not what your father wants or what your people need, but what you personally choose. Wiaka met his eyes directly, and Samuel saw in her expression the kind of courage that came from someone who'd learned to find strength in circumstances that offered no easy choices. I choose to trust that a man who asks such questions might be someone worth trusting in return, she said quietly. I choose to believe that sacrifice shared between honorable people can become something more valuable than happiness pursued alone. As the meeting began to disperse and the complex logistics of an unprecedented marriage were discussed by people whose job was to transform political necessities into legal realities, Samuel found himself thinking about second chances and the strange paths that led people from one kind of life to another. For years ago, he'd been a man slowly dying of loneliness on an isolated ranch where memories were his only companions. Now he was apparently about to become a husband again, a protector of people he barely understood, and a participant in efforts to preserve cultures that existed on the margins of a world that had little patience for inconvenient diversity. It wasn't the future he'd planned or the life he'd imagined when he buried his first family beneath Texas soil that seemed to swallow hope as efficiently as it swallowed rain. But looking at Wiaka's face as she spoke quietly with her father about the practical arrangements that would transform her from Lakota daughter into rancher's wife, Samuel felt something stirring in his chest that he thought was dead and buried along with everything else he'd loved and lost. Maybe redemption didn't require forgetting the past or pretending that loss hadn't carved permanent spaces in a man's heart. Maybe it just required finding something worth protecting that was larger than personal grief, something that could transform solitude from punishment into preparation for responsibilities that matter more than individual comfort. The wedding took place 10 days later in the parlor of Judge Harrison's house, witnessed by Agent Morrison, Chief Standing Bear, and a handful of ranchers whose presence would make the union legally unquestionable in the eyes of territorial law. Samuel wore his best suit, the same one he'd been married in 18 years earlier, while Wiaka appeared in a dress that bridged two worlds, white lace and traditional beadwork, creating something entirely new from the merger of different traditions. Do you, Samuel James McKenna, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Judge Harrison asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that the ceremony was creating more than just a marriage. It was establishing a legal precedent that would protect an entire people from displacement. "I do," Samuel said, meeting Wiaka's eyes as he spoke the words that would bind them together in the eyes of both white law and Lakota tradition. "And do you, Wiaka Standing Bear, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Wiaka's pause lasted only seconds, but Samuel could see the weight of everything she was accepting. Not just marriage to a stranger, but transformation from daughter of a chief into wife of a white rancher, from someone whose identity was defined by tribal membership into someone who would exist between cultures for the rest of her life. "I do," she said clearly, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from someone who'd made peace with sacrifices that would have broken lesser spirits. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Texas, I pronounce you husband and wife," Harrison announced. "May God bless this union and the purposes it serves." The ride back to Samuel's ranch took them through country that would now be legally protected from government seizure, 12,000 acres of prime grazing land that had become part of the McKenna spread through marriage contracts that transformed political necessity into personal reality. They traveled in Samuel's wagon, sitting side by side but maintaining the careful distance of strangers who committed to sharing a life without yet understanding what that commitment would require. "Are you afraid?" Samuel asked as they approached the cluster of buildings that would now be Wiaka's home, as well as his own. "Terrified," she admitted with the honesty that seemed to characterize all her interactions. "But not of you. I'm afraid of failing my people, of discovering that this sacrifice was insufficient to protect what we're trying to preserve." "And I'm afraid of failing you," Samuel replied, "of being the kind of husband who takes more than he gives, who sees marriage as acquisition rather than partnership." Wiaka studied his profile as he guided the horses along the familiar track that led to buildings that had stood empty of feminine presence for 4 years. "Your first wife," she said carefully, "what was she like?" Samuel felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied any discussion of Clara, but found that talking to Wiaka about loss was somehow easier than the conversations he'd had with well-meaning neighbors who try to offer comfort through platitudes that missed the mark entirely. "She was like morning light," Samuel said finally. Everything about her was warmth and possibility. "She could make a house feel like home just by being in it, could make me believe that tomorrow will be better than today just by smiling when I walked through the door." "You still love her," Wiaka observed, not as accusation, but as simple acknowledgement of reality. "Always will," Samuel confirmed. "Question is whether that leaves room for other kinds of love, different kinds of partnership. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm willing to find out if you are. In our traditions, the heart is large enough to hold many different loves without diminishing any of them," Wiaka said. "Love for family, love for land, love for people we choose to honor with our commitment. I don't expect to replace what you had with your first wife. I hope to build something different, but equally valuable. The house that greeted them carried the unmistakable signs of a place where a man had been living alone for too long. Clean but sparse, functional but lacking the small touches that transformed shelter into home. Wiaka moved through the rooms with careful attention, noting not just what was present but what was absent. Reading the story of grief and withdrawal that Samuel's domestic arrangements told without words. This was their room, Samuel said, opening the door to the small bedroom that had been prepared for his son, still furnished with a hand-carved crib and rocking chair that hadn't been used since Thomas's death. Wiaka studied the preserved space with the respectful attention of someone who understood that grief took many forms, that some people honored loss by preserving what had been while others found peace through transformation. "Would you like me to change it?" she asked gently. "I don't know," Samuel admitted. "Part of me wants to keep it exactly as it was, and part of me thinks that might not be fair to whatever future we're trying to build." "Then we'll wait," Wiaka said simply, "until we both know what feels right, what honors the past without imprisoning the present." They spent their first evening as husband and wife establishing routines that would carry them to the careful period of learning to share space without stepping on each other's emotional boundaries. Wiaka prepared supper with ingredients from Samuel's well-stocked pantry, transforming basic supplies into a meal that carried flavors he hadn't tasted in years. Samuel tended to evening chores while she worked, giving her time to establish ownership of kitchen space without feeling observed or judged. "You cook like someone who learned from a grandmother," Samuel observed as they shared the meal that marked their first domestic collaboration. "My grandmother believed that food was one of the languages that connected people across cultural boundaries," Wiaka replied. She said that meals prepared with care could build understanding between strangers faster than years of formal conversation. "What other languages did she teach you?" Samuel asked, genuinely curious about the traditions that had shaped someone capable of accepting marriage to a stranger as a reasonable solution to impossible circumstances. "The language of silence," Wiaka said, her voice carrying the cadence of someone who'd been raised on wisdom passed down through generations. "The language of listening to what the land is trying to tell you. The language of finding strength in circumstances that seem designed to break your spirit." As they settled into their separate bedrooms, the arrangement they'd agreed upon until their relationship evolved beyond the practical necessities that had brought them together, Samuel found himself thinking about the strange paths that led people from one kind of life to another. Yesterday, he'd been a widower whose greatest challenge was getting through each day without drowning in memories of what he'd lost. Now he was a husband again, a protector of people whose survival depended on his willingness to honor commitments that went far beyond personal preference. In her room, Wiaka sat by the window looking out at land that was now legally hers as much as Samuel's, thinking about the complex mathematics of sacrifice and salvation that had brought her to this place. She'd given up the possibility of marrying for love, of choosing her own path through life, of remaining connected to her people in the ways that had defined her identity since childhood. But in exchange, she'd gained something that might be more valuable than personal happiness. The knowledge that her sacrifice had meaning, that the children of her people would grow up on land that remembered their ancestors, that cultural traditions would survive even if they had to adapt to new realities. It wasn't a life she dreamed of, but it was a life with purpose, and purpose, her grandmother had taught her, was often more sustaining than happiness when circumstances demanded more than individual desires could provide. 6 weeks into their marriage, Samuel discovered that Wiaka possessed knowledge that transformed his ranch from a place where he merely survived into something approaching prosperity. She understood the land in ways that went beyond simple agricultural techniques, reading signs and weather patterns and animal behavior that allowed her to predict everything from drought conditions to the optimal timing for moving cattle between pastures. "The grass along the North Creek is telling us that we need to move the herd before the week ends," Wiaka said one morning as they shared coffee on the porch that had become their preferred place of conversations that were gradually transforming strangers into partners. "How can grass tell us anything?" Samuel asked, not skeptical exactly, but curious about knowledge systems that operated by logic he didn't recognize. "By the way it's changing color, the direction it's bending, the insects that are choosing to feed on it versus the insects that are moving away, Wiaka explained with the patience of someone who'd been raised to understand that teaching required meeting people where they were rather than expecting them to intuitively grasp concepts that took years to master. And what is it telling you? That the spring that feeds that creek is shifting its course underground, probably because of the heavy rains we had last month. The water table is dropping in that area, which means the grass will be stressed within days, and our cattle will be competing for water sources that can't support the numbers we're currently running there. Samuel absorbed this information, understanding that he was receiving education in land management techniques that his own culture had never developed, knowledge that had been refined over generations of people who'd learned to read the landscape like a language written in signs that most white ranchers never even noticed. Where should we move them? South Meadow, Wiaka said immediately. The water there is fed by deeper springs that aren't affected by seasonal changes, and the grass is entering the part of its growth cycle where cattle grazing will actually strengthen the root systems rather than damage them. What followed was a collaboration that revealed depths of competence Samuel had only begun to appreciate in his new wife. She moved among the cattle with understanding that went beyond simple animal husbandry, reading their behavior for signs of health problems or environmental stresses that could affect the entire herd. More importantly, she worked with efficiency that spoke of someone who'd been raised to understand that success in harsh country required everyone to contribute their full capabilities regardless of conventional gender roles. You know more about ranch management than most men who've been doing it their entire lives, Samuel observed as they completed a move that had probably saved him significant financial losses. I know about living in harmony with land that doesn't forgive mistakes, Wiaka corrected. Your people often try to impose their will on the landscape. My people learned to work with natural patterns because fighting them was usually fatal. Is that why you agreed to this marriage? Because you understood that fighting the government would be fatal for your people. Wiaka was quiet for a long moment, studying Samuel's face as if trying to determine whether he was genuinely curious about her motivations or testing her commitment to their arrangement. I agreed because I understood that sometimes the only way to preserve what matters most is to change everything else about how you live, she said finally. And you think this is working? The marriage, the legal protections, the integration of our peoples? I think it's too early to know, Wiaka replied honestly. But I think we're both trying to make it work, which is more than many marriages have going for them. As summer deepened and their domestic routines became more natural, Samuel found himself appreciating not just Wiaka's practical competence, but the subtle ways she begun to transform his house from a place marked by loss into something that felt like home again. She'd rearranged furniture to encourage conversation rather than solitude, had started a garden behind the house where vegetables and medicinal herbs grew in neat rows that spoke of knowledge passed down through generations, had filled empty spaces with the kind of small touches that made rooms feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. You're changing this place, Samuel said one evening as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Is that troubling to you? Wiaka asked, ready to adjust her approach if she'd overstepped boundaries he hadn't clearly defined. It's healing, Samuel admitted, surprised by his own honesty. I didn't realize how much I'd been living in a museum to my own grief until you started making it feel like a place where people actually live. Grief deserves honor, Wiaka said gently, but it shouldn't be allowed to prevent new life from taking root. That evening, for the first time since their marriage, Samuel found himself talking about Clara and Thomas not as wounds that couldn't heal, but as memories that could coexist with present happiness. Wiaka listened with the kind of attention that made sharing pain feel like relief rather than betrayal, offering perspective that came from someone who'd also learned to carry loss without being crushed by its weight. In our traditions, we believe that the people we love never truly leave us, Wiaka said when Samuel had finished recounting stories that he kept locked inside himself for 4 years. They become part of the wisdom we carry forward, part of the love we're able to offer to new people who enter our lives. Do you think Clara would approve of you? Samuel asked, the question carrying more vulnerability than he'd intended to reveal. I think she would want you to be happy, Wiaka replied. And I think she would understand that happiness sometimes requires us to risk loving again, even when love has hurt us before. As they prepared for bed in their separate rooms, an arrangement that had become less about necessity and more about mutual respect for the pace at which their relationship was developing, Samuel found himself thinking about transformation and the strange alchemy that could turn practical arrangements into something approaching genuine partnership. He was beginning to understand that Wiaka had saved more than her people through their marriage. She'd saved him from the kind of isolation that slowly killed men from the inside out, had reminded him what it felt like to share responsibility for something larger than his own survival. It wasn't a passionate love he'd shared with Clara, but it was something equally valuable: respect, companionship, and the growing awareness that some kinds of love develop slowly, built on shared purpose and mutual appreciation rather than immediate attraction. In her room, Wiaka sat by the window, thinking about the unexpected directions their marriage had taken. The way Samuel's initial kindness had deepened into something that felt like genuine care for her well-being rather than mere obligation to honor their agreement. She'd expected respectful coexistence, and had found something approaching partnership, something that suggested their marriage might become real in all the ways that mattered. She still missed her people, still felt the weight of representing not just herself but the survival of an entire culture in every decision she made. But for the first time since accepting her father's proposal, Wiaka allowed herself to hope that sacrifice and happiness might not be mutually exclusive, that saving her people and saving herself might turn out to be the same thing accomplished through different means. The letter arrived on a crisp October morning, carried by a territorial messenger whose grim expression suggested that its contents would test everything Samuel and Wiaka had built together over the past 6 months. The paper bore the official seal of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the formal language couldn't disguise the threat it contained. Recent changes in federal policy required reassessment of all land arrangements involving Native American individuals, with particular attention to marriages of convenience that may have been contracted to circumvent legitimate governmental authority. "They're going to try to invalidate our marriage," Samuel said, setting the letter aside with hands that weren't entirely steady. Claim it was a fraud designed to cheat the government out of rightful jurisdiction over tribal lands. Wiaka absorbed this news with the kind of calm that came from someone who'd learned to expect setbacks whenever things began going too well. What would that mean for my people? Forced relocation to the reservation in Oklahoma, loss of all traditional territories, probably the end of your band as a functioning community. Samuel's voice carried the weight of someone who understood that they were discussing cultural genocide disguised as administrative policy. And for us, annulment of our marriage on grounds of fraud. You'd lose your citizenship status. I'd lose the legal protections that have kept federal authorities from seizing the land your father placed under my stewardship. They sat in the silence that followed, each calculating costs and possibilities in the mathematics of love and law that govern relationships between peoples who'd learned to see each other as competitors for the same resources. Samuel found himself thinking about 6 months of gradual transformation, of slowly learning to appreciate not just Wiaka's competence, but her quiet strength, her wisdom, the way she'd help him remember what it felt like to care about something beyond his own survival. "There's one way to make the marriage legally unquestionable," Samuel said finally, understanding that he was about to offer something that would transform their careful arrangement into something far more intimate and complicated. "What way?" "Make it real in all the ways that matter to federal investigators. Share a bedroom. Share a life. Become the kind of husband and wife that no government official could claim was merely political convenience." Wiaka studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to read intentions that would determine the rest of her life. "Are you saying you want our marriage to become real, or that you think it's necessary for our marriage to appear real?" "I'm saying that somewhere along the way, it already became real for me," Samuel admitted, his voice carrying a kind of honesty that made vulnerability feel like strength rather than weakness. "I'm saying that what started as duty has become something I value more than duty, something I want to protect even if the government wasn't forcing us to choose." "You love me," Wiaka said, not as a question but as recognition of something that had been growing between them despite their efforts to maintain emotional distance. "I love you," Samuel confirmed. "Not the same way I loved Clara, but in ways that honor what we built together, ways that acknowledge who you are rather than trying to make you into someone else." Wiaka felt tears gathering in her eyes. The first tears she'd allowed herself to shed since accepting her father's proposal 6 months earlier. "I love you, too," she whispered. "I've been afraid to admit it because I thought loving you might betray the sacrifice I was supposed to be making for my people. Maybe the sacrifice was never supposed to be permanent, Samuel suggested. Maybe it was supposed to teach us both something about what's possible when people choose to trust each other despite impossible circumstances. What followed was a wedding night that bore no resemblance to the careful politeness that had marked the early weeks of their marriage. Samuel and Wiaka came together not as strangers fulfilling obligations, but as partners who discovered that respect and shared purpose could transform into something deeper and more sustaining than passion alone. "You're beautiful," Samuel whispered as moonlight painted patterns across skin that told stories of survival and strength, of someone who'd learned to carry responsibility for others without losing her own identity in the process. "You're healing," Wiaka replied, noting how the lines of grief that had marked his face when they first met had been replaced by something approaching peace. "You're becoming the man you were before loss taught you to be afraid of carrying too much." The months that followed their true wedding night brought changes that transformed not just their marriage, but their place in the community that surrounded them. Word had spread about the legal challenges to their union, and the response had surprised everyone involved. Neighboring ranchers, many of whom had initially been skeptical about the political marriage between Samuel and Wiaka, rallied to support a relationship that had clearly evolved beyond mere convenience. Mrs. McKenna's knowledge of land management has increased the productivity of every ranch in the county, testified John Patterson, whose own cattle operation had benefited from techniques Wiaka had shared during community gatherings. Any attempt to invalidate her citizenship or her marriage would be a loss for the entire territory. The hearing that would determine their fate took place in the same courthouse where they'd been married, but this time the room was packed with supporters whose presence spoke to the connections they'd built through 6 months of proving that cultural differences could be bridges rather than barriers. Judge Harrison presided, his face showing the strain of someone who understood that his decision would establish precedents affecting countless other families facing similar challenges. "Mr. and Mrs. McKenna," Harrison said after 3 hours of testimony that it covered everything from their domestic arrangements to the agricultural innovations that had improved their ranch's productivity. "The court finds that your marriage is genuine in all respects that matter to the law. Any attempt to annul this union on grounds of fraud would be unsupported by evidence and contrary to the best interests of the territory." The celebration that followed brought together people who'd learned that Samuel and Wiaka's unlikely partnership had created benefits that extended far.